Representation of the People Act 1918 was a huge step forward, a concession of principle that some women could now vote for the first time. But it did leave unfinished business because it was only women over the age of 30 who met minimum property qualifications who could vote. And it took another 10 years after that for the Equal Franchise Act 1928 to pass, which gave women the vote on the same terms as men. It's sometimes wondered, why did it take 10 years for this to happen? The suffrage organisations did not forget about it, I think it's important to say first, but they did move on to other issues because that was why they wanted the vote in the first place. And having gotten the vote for some women in 1918, they went on to have to pressure Parliament to pass a whole raft of legislation over the next 10 years, which affected women's rights in many ways and gender equality in areas such as guardianship of children, entrance to professions, property inheritance, pensions for widows and orphans, and all of this took a lot of campaigning time. However, it was never forgotten that equal franchise was unfinished business. But it took a while for a government to come along which had the political will to get such an act to pass. The House of Commons actually passed a bill as early as 1919 in favour of equal franchise, so there was a majority in the Commons almost immediately after 1918. But there was no government will to pass it. They had a lot of other priorities, especially immediately after the First World War. And successive governments just did not make enough time. But in 1925, a Conservative government came in, which had a sympathetic leader. This was Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, and he had a sympathetic Home Secretary, William Joynson Hicks. And together, along with pressure from some of the early women MPs in Parliament, including Nancy Astor, and the campaigners outside Parliament, still pushing, still doing their job with that, they eventually managed to get equal franchise through. This was in the teeth of opposition from other cabinet ministers, and amongst the cabinet ministers who still opposed this, it has to be said, was Winston Churchill. He opposed equal franchise to the bitter end, even asking for a note to be put in a cabinet record that he opposed it when he was hopelessly outnumbered. And the reason for this is he thought it would be the downfall of the Conservative Party. How wrong he was, I think we can say today. The conditions were finally right in 1928, with Parliament support, with a sympathetic government in place, and with enough pressure being brought to bear from outside, from the female campaigners, finally for an act to pass. So the Equal Franchise Act was passed in 1928, and women voted for the first time on the same terms as men the following year.